She had 3 days to pack her entire life into a single trunk and marry a man whose face she'd never seen. The snow was already coming down hard the morning Eleanor Pierce's father sat her across the kitchen table and told her, with the same tired calm he used for everything, that her future had been decided. No argument, no discussion, a done deal, signed between two men over a bottle of whiskey and a handshake. The stranger's name was Silas Kane. He trapped animals for a living and lived alone in the mountains. That was all her father knew. That was all Eleanor got. If you've ever had someone make the biggest decision of your life without asking you, stay with me. Because this story is about what happens next. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Like if you believe people can choose their own fate, even when life gives them no choice at all. The letter came on a Tuesday. Not that the day of the week meant much out on the frontier. Days blurred into each other, the way the gray sky blurred into the gray mountains. One long, continuous stretch of cold and work and more work. But Eleanor Pierce would remember it was a Tuesday because she had just finished mending the same pair of her father's wool socks for the 4th time that month, sitting by the window where the light was best, squinting at thread that kept slipping through the needle's eye. She remembered thinking that the socks were past saving, that no amount of careful stitching could hold together something that had worn through so completely. She didn't know yet that she was thinking about more than socks. Her father, Thomas Pierce, came through the front door stamping snow off his boots and holding a folded piece of paper like it was something valuable, which should have been her first warning. Thomas Pierce didn't treat paper carefully. He treated paper the way he treated most things, roughly, absently, as a means to an end. "Got something here," he said, not quite meeting her eyes as he pulled off his coat. "Something we need to talk about." Eleanor set down the socks. "What kind of something?" He sat across from her at the table. The same table where they ate every meal in near silence. The same table where, 2 years ago, her mother had spread out the deed to this land and explained in her quiet, practical voice that the frontier didn't forgive dreamers, only workers. Eleanor's mother had been dead 14 months now, and the table felt larger every day. Thomas smoothed the paper with his palm, which was something he did when he was nervous. She had seen that gesture maybe twice in her entire life. "Silas Kane," he said. "I don't know that name." "No, you wouldn't." He cleared his throat. "He's a trapper. Good one, from what I hear. Been working these mountains for years. Knows the land better than most men know their own kitchen." Eleanor waited. "He's looking to settle," Thomas continued. "Looking to, well, he's at an age where a man starts thinking about more than just himself. And he's got a good cabin, solid, well supplied. He's got connections with the trading post down in Harrow, so he never goes hungry, not even in the worst winters." The silence stretched out between them like ice over a deep pond. Eleanor could hear it cracking. "Pa?" "He's a decent man, Eleanor. Everyone who knows him says so." "Pa, what did you do?" Thomas finally looked at her. His eyes were the pale, watery blue of a winter sky, and right now they carried something she hadn't seen in them before. Not guilt exactly, more like a man who had already made his peace with the decision and was only now informing the other party. "I've arranged for you to marry him," he said. "He'll come through on the 20th. You'll travel back to his property together. It's 3 days north, up past the Caldwell Ridge." The needle slipped from Eleanor's fingers and hit the floor. She didn't reach for it. For a long moment she sat completely still, and the only sound was the wind testing the corners of the cabin and the small, persistent crackle of the fire. She was aware, in some distant and almost clinical way, that she should be speaking, that there were words she was supposed to be saying right now, but they were all tangled up somewhere behind her sternum, knotted together with something hot and formless that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to be grief or rage. It turned out to be rage. "You arranged it," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, which somehow made it worse. "You're 20 years old, Eleanor. The Harmon girl married at 17. The Vesper girls were both—" "I am not the Harmon girl. I'm not the Vesper girls." She pushed back from the table and stood up, and the chair scraped the floor like a curse. "You sat down with a stranger and handed him my life like it was a parcel of land, like I was something that could be traded. That's not what this is." "Then what is it? Explain it to me, Pa, because from where you're standing, His voice took on a harder edge now, the one that meant he'd reached the limit of his patience. From where you're standing, you're a young woman alone on the frontier with a father who's got one good lung left, and a property that'll need two strong backs come spring. From where I'm standing, I'm a man trying to make sure his daughter doesn't starve when he's gone. The words landed like a slap because they weren't wrong. That was the worst part. They weren't wrong, and they both knew it, and there was no clean anger to be had when the thing you were furious about also made a brutal, practical sense. The frontier didn't care about feelings. The frontier didn't care about what was fair. The frontier was 3 feet of snow on the ground by November, and wolves that came close enough to the cabin some nights that you could hear them breathing. Eleanor turned to the window. Outside, the mountains rose in their indifferent way, enormous and white and entirely unmoved by the small human drama playing out in this small human cabin at their feet. "What's he like?" she finally said. Flat, like she was asking about livestock. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Quiet. They say he's quiet. Never been in trouble. Doesn't drink more than a man ought to. Keeps his word. "Have you met him?" A pause. "Once. Briefly. At the trading post in Harrow last autumn. And you thought he'd make a good husband for me based on one meeting." "I thought he'd make a safe one." Thomas folded the paper again, creasing it sharp and precise. "There's a difference, Eleanor. Out here, safe is worth more than good." She didn't answer him. There wasn't anything to answer. She walked to her room, closed the door without slamming it. She was her mother's daughter. She didn't slam doors. And sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long time, listening to the wind. She thought about her options. She laid them out one by one the way her mother had taught her to approach any problem, systematically, without letting feeling cloud the inventory. She could refuse. She could refuse absolutely and completely, and tell her father that no arrangement of his had any claim on her person, and she would be right, technically, legally, morally. She could refuse and stay here, and when her father's lung gave out entirely, she would be alone on this property with one horse and a root cellar that would not last a winter. She could run. The thought moved through her mind with a grim kind of humor. Run where exactly? The nearest town with real options was 4 days south, and she had $11 to her name and no letters of recommendation and no trade except the domestic ones that every woman on the frontier had and that none of them got paid for. Or she could go. She could get in a wagon with a stranger named Silas Kane and travel 3 days north into mountains she didn't know and make the best of whatever waited for her there. She hated that this was the math. She hated that it added up so cleanly. She hated that her mother, practical woman that she was, would probably have understood the decision even while sympathizing with the fury underneath it. Safe is worth more than good. Eleanor lay back on her bed and stared at the ceiling and let herself feel every miserable inch of it before she packed it away. She met Silas Kane on a Thursday morning, 9 days later. He arrived at their cabin just after sunrise, which told her something about him immediately. A man who arrived at sunrise was a man who had been traveling for a while already, who didn't sleep in, who took his obligations seriously enough to be early rather than late. She wasn't sure yet whether that was a comfort or another thing to resent. She heard the horse first, then her father's voice, warmer than she'd heard it in months, going out to meet someone. She was already dressed. She had been up since before dawn because sleep had mostly abandoned her in the past week, and she stood at the window and watched the man dismount. He was taller than she'd expected. She hadn't formed a clear picture in her mind, deliberately avoiding the exercise of imagining him because it seemed like surrendering something. But now, watching him through the wavy glass of the window, she noticed the height first, then the breadth of him, not the performed broadness of a man who wanted to appear large, but the functional kind that came from years of actual physical work. He moved carefully. That was the next thing. He handed the reins to nobody, just looped them over the post himself, and checked the horse's feet before he walked to the door, which was a small thing, but the kind of small thing Eleanor's mother had always said you should watch for. "Watch how a man treats the things that can't speak for themselves," her mother had said once. Animals, children, the ground under his boots. That'll tell you more than anything he says. He knocked. She heard the knock through the wall, measured and unhurried. She took a breath and went to open the door. Up close, he was not handsome in any conventional way the word got used. His face had been weathered into something past that, angular and deeply lined for a man who looked to be in his mid-30s, with dark eyes set beneath heavy brows and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. He wore a coat that was clearly functional and recently mended at the left shoulder. His hands, when he removed his hat, were calloused to the point of looking like they were made of different material than ordinary hands. He looked at her with those dark, quiet eyes, and he said, "Miss Pierce?" "Not ma'am." Not any of the performative courtesies that men used to signal that they had noticed a woman and wanted her to know it. Just her name, plain. "Mr. Kane," she said. "I appreciate you agreeing to this." She nearly told him that agreeing wasn't quite the word she'd have chosen, but she bit it back. It wasn't his fault her father was her father, or at least she didn't know yet whose fault it was, and she had made a private commitment to herself to be fair until she had reason not to be. "Come in," she said instead. "Coffee's on." He came in. He wiped his boots thoroughly on the mat, another small thing, and sat at the table where her father was already seated, and the three of them drank coffee in a silence that had different qualities for each of them. Thomas was visibly relieved. Silas was simply quiet. The way Eleanor was beginning to suspect was just his natural state. And Eleanor held her mug with both hands and watched the stranger who was supposedly now her future and tried to take her own measure of him. He didn't try to fill the silence with impressive stories. He didn't make expansive promises about the cabin or the land or how well he'd provide. When her father asked about the winter conditions up north, he answered directly and without embellishment. "Bad," he said. "Worse than last year, probably." The elk had moved early, which usually meant the cold was coming harder. He'd spent the last 2 weeks laying in extra wood. "Smart," Thomas said. Silas shrugged one shoulder. "Necessary." Eleanor watched him and thought, "This is the man who is going to determine the shape of my life." She turned the thought over like a stone, looking for how she felt about it, and found something more complicated than she was prepared for. Not comfort, not acceptance, but not the pure, clean terror she'd been bracing for either. Just uncertainty. A vast gray uncertainty that felt somehow more honest than false reassurance would have. The journey north took 3 days, as promised. They traveled in Silas's wagon, which was heavier than it looked, loaded with supplies he'd brought down for trading. He had hitched 2 horses rather than 1, a deliberate choice, she realized later, because the mountain roads in early winter required 2 horses, and he had known that before he left home. The first day they barely spoke. Eleanor sat on the bench beside him with her trunk loaded in the back and her hands folded in her lap, watching the landscape change from the flatter terrain around her father's property into the beginning of the true mountain country. The trees thickened and darkened, the road narrowed and steepened. Snow that was merely decorative at lower elevations became serious, functional, several feet deep in the drifts between the pines. Silas drove the horses with the quiet competence of someone who had done this exact thing many hundreds of times. He didn't push them. He read the road in a way that Eleanor, who had grown up in a different part of the frontier, found herself reluctantly watching. The small adjustments he made without any visible thought, the way he gave the horses their heads on the steeper grades and asked more from them on the flat sections where they could give it. Around midday, he stopped at a place where the road widened, and there was a natural windbreak formed by a cluster of old pines. "Horses need water," he said. "And you probably need to—" He paused, and for the first time she saw something almost uncomfortable in his face. "I'll tend to the horses." He meant she should walk into the trees for privacy. It was such an ordinary human consideration, delivered with such care not to embarrass her, that it momentarily disarmed her. "Thank you," she said, and meant it, and was slightly annoyed at herself for meaning it. He handed her a tin cup of water from the canteen without being asked, and she took it and walked into the trees. And when she came back, he was pouring oats for the horses and didn't look up immediately, giving her the small dignity of returning before he acknowledged her. "Small things," her mother had said. "Watch the small things." She climbed back onto the bench and they continued north, and the silence between them shifted by some barely perceptible degree into something less like 2 strangers ignoring each other and more like 2 people who had agreed, without discussing it, that silence was acceptable. That night they stopped at a way station, a rough building maintained by a trapping consortium, available to anyone traveling the mountain roads. It had 2 rooms. Without any discussion or awkwardness, Silas put Eleanor's trunk in the room with the better stove and rolled out his own bedding in the smaller room with the drafty window. She lay awake in the dark and listened to him moving around in the other room, quiet and efficient, and thought about the life she was heading toward. She thought about her mother's hands, how they had looked at the end, rough and mapped with work, and how her mother had looked at those hands sometimes with a complicated expression that Eleanor had never quite decoded. Not regret, not pride either. Something in between. Something that understood cost without being destroyed by it. "You'll be all right," she told herself in her mother's voice, because she had no other voice for such things anymore. "You'll be all right. Just keep your eyes open." The second day was harder. The road climbed more aggressively, and by mid-morning a wind had come up from the north that pushed against the wagon with genuine malice. Eleanor had packed well, her mother's daughter, and she had a good wool coat and layers beneath it. But the cold at this elevation was a different animal than the cold she knew. It got into places cold wasn't supposed to reach. Silas, she noticed, was not dressed for comfort. His coat was good but not as heavy as hers. When she mentioned this, not with concern but as a matter of simple observation, he glanced at her and said, "I run warm. Always have." She thought this was probably a lie, a small one, a courteous one, but she didn't pursue it. Around noon, with the wind at its worst, something happened that cracked open the silence between them for the first time. One of the horses stumbled. It wasn't a serious stumble. The road had a rough patch hidden under an inch of fresh snow, and the left side horse caught its foot wrong and lurched sideways before catching itself. But it was enough to throw the wagon's rhythm, and Eleanor grabbed the bench with both hands, and when she looked over, Silas was already pulling the horses to a stop, his face alert and sharp in a way it hadn't been a second ago. He was down from the wagon before it fully stopped. He went to the left horse and lifted its foot with a practiced motion, examining the hoof, running his hand up the leg to the knee. "Sound," he said after a moment. "Just caught a stone." "You were fast," Eleanor said. She hadn't planned to say it. He looked up at her from beside the horse. "Can't afford not to be. Up here, you lose a horse. You lose a lot more than just the horse." "I know." She paused. "I grew up on the frontier too." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like a recalibration. "I know you did. I didn't mean—" He stopped. "I wasn't explaining it to you. I was answering your observation." "Fair enough." He held her gaze for a moment, and Eleanor had the odd and slightly unnerving feeling that he was actually looking at her. Not at a woman, not at an arrangement, not at a problem that had been solved. At her, specifically, like he was trying to understand something. Then he looked away and climbed back up and clicked the horses forward, and they continued up the mountain. But the silence was different after that. Thinner, somehow, with more air in it. That night, the second night, they made camp rather than pushing to reach the next way station, because the light went too fast and the road was treacherous in the dark. Silas built a fire with the efficient movements of someone for whom fire building was as automatic as breathing. He put together a camp dinner from the supplies in the wagon: dried venison, hardtack, some dried apples that were better than they had any right to be, and they sat on either side of the fire and ate. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said. "Yes." "Why did you agree to this, the arrangement?" She watched his face across the fire. "You don't seem like a man who needs... You seem like someone who was managing fine." He ate for a moment before answering. "Managing fine is different from living well." "That's a careful answer." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, she wouldn't call it that, but something that acknowledged she'd caught him being precise rather than honest. "I'm 34 years old," he said. "I've spent those years getting very good at being alone. I'm starting to wonder if that was something to be proud of or just something that happened while I wasn't paying attention." Eleanor considered this. "And you thought a stranger arranged by her father was the answer to that question?" "I thought it was worth attempting something different." "That's still a careful answer." "I know." He poked the fire with a stick, sending up a small shower of sparks. "Ask me again in 6 months." Eleanor looked at the fire. A log shifted and settled, and the flames went orange and then blue at the center. "What happens if we... What's your expectation of this arrangement? What does it look like to you?" He looked up from the fire and looked at her directly and said, "Whatever you're willing for it to be." The words were so simple and so completely without performance that Eleanor didn't know what to do with them for a moment. "That's not an answer," she said. "It's the only honest one I have." He held her gaze. "I'm not going to pretend I have expectations of you. I made an arrangement with your father, and I understand that's a thing done to you more than for you, and I'm not going to compound that by showing up at the door with a list of demands." He paused. "You'll have your own room, your own space. I'll not ask for anything you don't want to give, and if after a season you decide this isn't livable, we'll figure out something else." Eleanor stared at him. "Most men wouldn't say that. Most men would be lying if they did, maybe. I'm not most men." He said it without arrogance, just as fact. "You could be lying now." "I could be," he agreed. "You'd have to wait and see." She looked at the fire again. The mountains around them were absolute in the darkness. Enormous presences felt more than seen. The cold was coming down hard now that the fire was their only heat, and somewhere not too far away something moved through the trees with a sound that might have been wind and might not have been. "I'll wait and see," Eleanor said. It wasn't trust. It was nowhere near trust. But it was the first thing she'd said in 9 days that didn't feel like surrender. They arrived at his property on the morning of the third day. Eleanor had been bracing herself for disappointment, had been privately preparing a kind of stoic acceptance of something much worse than advertised. Because things on the frontier were always worse than advertised. Because optimism was a luxury for people who lived somewhere the weather didn't try to kill you. The cabin was not worse than advertised. It was not large. She would not call it large. 1 main room and 2 smaller ones, built from timber that had clearly been replaced and repaired over many years, with the patchwork quality of something that had been lived in and maintained rather than built all at once and left to rot. The roof was solid. She could see that from the outside. Solid and recently patched, with no sag in the ridgeline that would mean structural problems. The stovepipe was clean. The woodpile along the south wall was enormous, stacked with a precision that spoke of both industry and anxiety about the coming cold. Inside it was spare but not bleak. A table. 4 chairs, which struck her immediately. 4 chairs for a man living alone meant either optimism or loneliness or both. A cook stove in much better condition than she'd expected. Shelves built into the wall holding supplies with the practiced organization of someone who knew exactly what he had and exactly how long it would last. A rocking chair near the main stove, its arms worn smooth in the way that meant it was used, not displayed. The room that was to be hers was at the back of the cabin. Small. A bed, a chest, a window that faced east and would get the morning light. She stood in the doorway of it and looked at the bed and the chest and the eastern window, and she felt the full weight of where she was and how she'd arrived here and what she'd left behind, and she held all of it without letting it take her under because that was the only way to hold something that heavy. Behind her, she heard Silas set her trunk down in the main room. "I'll put this wherever you want it," he said. "Here," she said, "and here is fine." He carried it in and set it against the wall and straightened up. And they were both in the small room, and the proximity was suddenly very present, not threatening. There was nothing threatening about him, she was finding, and that was almost its own kind of unsettling because she had prepared for threat and didn't know quite what to do with the absence of it. "I'll start the stove in here," he said. "Takes about an hour to warm up properly." "I can do it." He paused. "I know you can. I wasn't—" He stopped again, and she had the sense he was being careful with language in a way most people weren't. "Old habit," he said finally. "I'll leave you to it." He went out and closed the door behind him. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the eastern window and let herself breathe. The window glass was wavy and old, but it was intact. Beyond it, the mountains rose steep and white against a pale sky. A gray bird she didn't recognize landed on the sill outside for a moment, regarded her with the absolute absence of judgment that birds had, and then flew away. She thought about her mother, about the table at home, and the mended socks and the watery blue of her father's eyes making his terrible, reasonable argument. She thought about $11 and 1 horse and a root cellar that wouldn't last a winter. She thought about 4 chairs and a 1-man cabin. Then she got up, found the wood box beside the small stove, built a fire from the kindling laid in the stove's belly already. He had laid it before he left to get her, she realized, so the cabin would warm quickly when they arrived. And she lit a match and held it to the tinder and watched the flame catch. She was not all right. She would not pretend she was all right. But she was here, and the fire was starting, and the window faced east for the morning light, and there were 4 chairs at the table of a man who had told her, beside a mountain campfire in the dark, that he would make no demands of her. Whether that was true remained to be seen, but she was going to watch the small things. She was going to keep her eyes open. Well, the first week passed in careful parallel. They were 2 people sharing a small space and navigating that sharing with the deliberate care of strangers who understood that one wrong step could make everything unbearable. Eleanor cooked in the mornings because she rose early, and it gave her something to do with the restless energy that came from sleeping in an unfamiliar place. She didn't ask permission, and he didn't comment on it, just sat down to whatever she put on the table and said thank you in the simple way she was starting to recognize as his default. No flourish, no performance, just the actual meaning of the words. He was out most of each day, checking traps, cutting wood, doing the 100 maintenance tasks that a frontier property demanded in the weeks before serious winter set in. She heard him working outside sometimes, the rhythmic crack of an axe, the occasional exchange of words with the horses, the sound of something being mended or repaired. She learned his sounds the way you learn the sounds of any new place, cataloging them into the background. When he came in at the end of the day, his face was always cold, and sometimes he was limping slightly, which he never mentioned. She noticed and said nothing. That felt like the correct balance for now. There was a moment, near the end of that first week, that she thought about later more than she expected to. She had gone out in the afternoon to get more wood from the pile. Her eastern room burned through wood faster than the main space. And she found Silas on one knee by the corner of the cabin with a bucket and a brush, sealing a gap in the foundation logs that the freeze-thaw cycle had opened up. His hands were in the cold sealant, and he was working methodically, smoothing it into the crack with fingers that had to be going numb. He looked up when she came around the corner and didn't say anything. "That needs to be done before the deep freeze," she said. "Yes. My father never did it. We lost heat through the base every winter." Silas looked back at the gap he was sealing. "Gap like this, maybe 10–15% heat loss easy. Not acceptable when you're burning as much wood as we will be." Eleanor picked up an armful of wood from the pile, started back for the cabin, stopped. "Your hands are going to crack," she said, without turning around. "There's lanolin in the chest in the main room, left side bottom shelf. Put some on when you're done." A pause. "All right," he said. She went inside. That evening, she noticed he'd found the lanolin. It was such a small thing, the smallest possible thing, but she thought about it in the dark that night, lying in her room with the fire in the small stove doing its steady work, and the mountains enormous and silent outside her eastern window. And she thought that small things were, perhaps, the only things that told you anything real. But 3 weeks in, something changed between them that she couldn't have articulated but felt as clearly as the change in the weather. He had come back from a long trap run, 2 days out, sleeping rough. And he was cold in a deeper way than usual, the kind of cold that gets into the bones and takes the heat out from the inside. She had made soup. She wasn't sure why, exactly. She had made more soup than one person needed, which was not accidental. He came in and she handed him a bowl without comment, and he sat down at the table and held it in both hands for a long moment before he drank any of it. Just held it, and she understood that he was warming his hands as much as he was eating, and she looked away to give him that privacy. "You didn't have to do this," he said eventually. "I made too much." "Eleanor." She looked up. He was looking at her across the table with those dark, quiet eyes, and his expression was... She didn't have a word for it, exactly. Serious, but not heavy, like something he'd been carrying had gotten slightly lighter without his permission. "Thank you," he said. "Not for the soup exactly, or not only for the soup." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, which was longer than she'd held it since they'd met. "You're welcome," she said, and it wasn't very much, as conversations went. It wasn't profound or romantic or any of the things that stories made such moments out to be. It was 2 people sitting across a table in a small cabin on the side of a mountain, with the first real winter wind beginning to press against the walls, finding out, for the first time, with something like surprise, that they might not be entirely strangers after all. Outside, the snow had started again, Inside, the soup was warm. That was all. That was enough for now. The snow that started the night of the soup didn't stop for 4 days. Eleanor had grown up with snow. She understood snow the way you understood something that had always been part of the landscape of your life. Present, expected, occasionally dangerous, never surprising. But the snow at this elevation, in these mountains, was a different thing entirely. It didn't fall so much as accumulate with a kind of relentless quiet purpose, building itself up against the cabin walls and the woodpile and the fence posts with no particular urgency and no intention of stopping. By the second morning, the drifts had reached the bottom of the eastern window, and Eleanor stood in her room watching the world outside disappear by inches, and felt, for the first time since arriving, the specific weight of how far she was from everything she had known. She didn't say anything about it. There was nobody to say it to, and besides, saying it wouldn't move the snow. Silas spent those 4 days doing the kinds of things a man does when winter pins him indoors: mending harnesses, sharpening tools, working through a pile of maintenance tasks with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. He didn't fill the silence with noise. He didn't check on her every hour or ask how she was adjusting with the well-meaning intrusiveness that would have made her want to climb the walls. He was simply present, quietly occupied, available without being hovering. On the third day of the storm, Eleanor found herself standing in the doorway between her room and the main space watching him repair a piece of tack, a bridle that had split at the cheekpiece, and she thought, "This is the strangest situation I have ever been in, and I cannot decide if it's better or worse than what I was afraid of." She still wasn't sure, but the not knowing had changed texture. It felt less like dread and more like something she was genuinely waiting to find out. "Does it always come this fast?" she asked. Silas didn't look up from the bridle. "The snow? Some years. This one's going to be heavy. Elk moved early, like I said. They know. And you're not worried." "Worried doesn't do much at this altitude." He turned the bridle in his hands, examining the stitch. "Prepared does more." "That's a thing you say a lot. Variations on it." Now he looked up. "Is it necessary, acceptable, prepared?" She leaned against the doorframe. "You think in practical terms." He considered this without defensiveness. "I think feelings are fine to have. I just don't find them particularly useful in a blizzard." "And outside of blizzards?" The question came out with more edge than she intended, and she heard it immediately and watched to see how he received it. He turned the bridle over again, ran his thumb along the repaired seam. "Outside of blizzards," he said slowly. "I'm still figuring that out." It wasn't a deflection. It was the closest thing to honest self-examination she had heard from a man in her life, and it caught her off guard enough that she didn't have a ready response. She went back to her room and picked up the book she'd brought from home and didn't read a single word of it for 20 minutes, just held it and thought about what it meant to be 34 years old and still figuring out how to feel things in daylight. The storm broke on this fourth day. The world outside remade itself in white and blue silence, and the mountains looked closer than they had before. Cleaner, like something had been clarified. Life resumed. There was always more to do than there were hours of light to do it in, which Eleanor understood was not a problem specific to this cabin or this arrangement, but simply the nature of frontier existence in the season before deep winter locked everything down. She fell into the work because the work was there, and because idleness in a space this small felt like an aggression against both of them. She learned the cabin's rhythms the way she'd learned the horse's moods on the road north, quietly, through observation, without asking more questions than necessary. The cook stove had a temperamental left burner that ran hot. She learned to compensate. The well was 40 yards from the cabin, and the path to it iced over every night, so you either fetched water before dusk or you were breaking ice off the bucket handle in the dark. The root cellar under the cabin held supplies organized with a precision she initially found excessive and later came to understand as the difference between knowing you had 6 weeks of potatoes and merely hoping you did. She learned these things, and she noticed that Silas noticed her learning them, and he said nothing about it. Didn't point out what she was doing, didn't offer unsolicited advice, didn't perform the particular kind of helpfulness that was really just a man reminding a woman that he knew more than she did. When she had a genuine question, she asked it. When she didn't, she figured it out. Once in the second month, she'd let herself burn a pan of cornbread, genuinely distracted by a bird she'd been watching through the window, a hawk riding thermals above the ridge with a patience that seemed almost philosophical, and when she pulled the blackened pan from the oven, she stood looking at it with an irritation directed entirely at herself. Silas came in from outside at that exact moment, looked at the pan, looked at her. "Hawk on the South Ridge?" he said. She blinked. "How did you—" "It's been there 3 mornings running. Hard to look away." He hung up his coat. "I burned a whole pot of venison stew watching it last winter. Ate burned venison for 4 days because I was too stubborn to throw it out." Eleanor looked at him. "Made more cornbread," he added simply, and went to wash his hands at the basin. She stood there holding the ruined pan and felt something loosen in her chest that had been pulled tight since the morning her father said the name Silas Kane. Not fully, not all at once, just a degree of loosening. The kind you don't make happen but find has happened when you weren't protecting against it. She made more cornbread. It came out fine. The neighbors arrived in stages over the next several weeks, which was how Eleanor learned that Silas Kane existed in a community in ways she hadn't anticipated from the picture she'd formed of a solitary man in a mountain cabin. There were the Aldermans first, Hector and Ruth, a couple in their 50s who had been in the valley longer than anyone else, and who arrived at the door one morning with a pot of something that smelled like venison and the specific forward energy of people who wanted to see for themselves what the trapper's new wife was like. Ruth Alderman was a small, sharp woman with work-roughened hands and eyes that missed nothing, and she looked Eleanor over in the first 30 seconds with an assessment so thorough it was almost flattering. "Well," Ruth said once they were all seated with coffee, "you're younger than I expected." "I'm 20, Eleanor said. "I know how old you are. I mean, you look younger." Ruth wrapped both hands around her mug. "This is a hard country for young. Doesn't stay young long." "Ruth," Hector said, "I'm not being unkind. I'm being accurate. She looks like she can handle it." Ruth turned her assessment to Silas. "She's settling in?" "You'd have to ask her," Silas said. Ruth looked back at Eleanor. "Well?" "I'm settling," Eleanor said. She didn't add more than that, and something in her tone apparently satisfied Ruth Alderman, because the woman gave a single nod and moved on to talking about the upcoming winter and the worrying state of the Pattersons' cattle, and whether the Caldwell family was going to make it through another season at their age. After they left, Eleanor stood at the window, watching their wagon until it disappeared around the tree line. "She's not unkind," Silas said from behind her. "She just doesn't waste time on formalities." I wasn't offended. I liked her. Most people are afraid of her. Eleanor turned. "I grew up with my mother. It takes a lot more than directness to unsettle me." She paused. "She likes you." Something in his expression shifted. "Known her since I first came to this valley. 9 years. She was checking if I was good enough. Probably." He picked up his coat from the hook. "She'd do the same if you were a man marrying her daughter. It's not about you specifically." "I know." Eleanor turned back to the window. "It's nice, actually, that someone would." He went out without answering, but at the door he paused for just a second, his back to her, long enough that she knew he'd heard. Other neighbors followed over the weeks. A young family named Vesper, no relation to the Vesper girls Eleanor had grown up hearing about, just a coincidence of names. With 2 children under 5 and the particular desperation of people who had come to the frontier with more hope than preparation and were discovering the gap between those 2 things. A bachelor trapper named Grunewald, who was one of those people so thoroughly comfortable with silence that even Silas seemed almost verbose by comparison. An older man called simply Wren, who lived alone on the high ridge and came down every few weeks to trade, and whose age was genuinely impossible to estimate. What Eleanor watched in all of these interactions was Silas. She watched him with the attention she'd been paying since she arrived, adding each observation to the picture she was building with the careful patience of someone who understood that a wrong reading could be costly. He listened to people, not performed listening, where you nodded and waited for your turn, real listening, where you sometimes didn't respond for 10 full seconds after someone finished speaking because you were actually considering what they'd said. It made some people uncomfortable. It didn't seem to bother Eleanor. She did the same thing. He gave things away with no apparent calculation. When young Jacob Vesper came by in early November with the news that their cow had died, a disaster for a family with 2 small children heading into winter, Silas went to the root cellar and came back with a week's worth of supplies: dried meat, cornmeal, a jar of preserved apple. Handed it over without ceremony, without making Jacob Vesper feel the size of the debt being incurred, just said he had more than he needed and would the family want to come to dinner on Sunday. Jacob Vesper left with the supplies and the dinner invitation, and something in his face that was trying to be dignity and mostly succeeding. "You didn't have to do that," Eleanor said after. "I know. We're heading into the worst of winter. We have enough." She watched his face. "Do we?" He met her eyes. "We'll have enough." She wasn't sure in that moment whether he was being genuinely certain or generously dishonest. She looked at his face and tried to read it and found, which was beginning to happen more frequently, and which she found genuinely unnerving, that she could not. There was a night in late November that she thought about long after. She had been writing a letter to her father, something she did every 2 weeks, letters that would only be sent when someone made the trip down to Harrow, which was not often, but writing them felt like maintaining a line. She was at the table by the lamp, writing, and Silas was in the rocking chair with a piece of cord he was working into something, and the fire was doing its steady work, and the wind outside was doing its other work, and it was one of those evenings that would have been, in other circumstances, simply domestic. She looked up from the letter and he was watching her, not in the way that required defense, in the way you watch something without meaning to because your attention had gone there on its own while you were occupied with something else. He looked back down at the cord. "What?" Eleanor said. "Nothing." "You were looking at me." "I was." He didn't deny it. "You write the same way you do everything, like you mean it." She didn't know what to do with that. It wasn't a compliment engineered to earn something. It was an observation, and it was accurate, and the accuracy of it was somehow more disarming than flattery would have been. "My mother taught me that if something was worth doing, it was worth your full attention," she said finally. "Smart woman." She was. A beat. "I miss her." The words came out more directly than she'd intended, and she felt briefly exposed by them, the way you felt when something true escaped before you'd decided to let it. She looked back down at the letter. "I'm sorry," Silas said. Simple. Not swathed in qualifications or careful sympathy, just sorry. "Thank you," Eleanor said, not looking up. They didn't speak again for a while. The fire moved and the wind pressed and the lamp threw its small yellow circle over the letter she was writing, and in the rocking chair across the room, Silas worked his cord into whatever it was becoming, and neither of them felt the need to fill the space between them with anything. Eleanor realized, writing the next line of her letter, that this was the first evening since she'd arrived that she had not been braced for something. The tension she'd been carrying, the constant low-grade vigilance of a person waiting to find out what this situation actually was, had gone quiet. Not gone. She wasn't fool enough to think gone, but quiet, resting, like something that had decided provisionally that it wasn't needed at this particular moment. She wrote 2 more pages to her father before she went to bed. She told him about the hawk on the South Ridge. She told him about Ruth Alderman and her direct eyes and her good pot of venison stew. She told him the cabin was warm and the root cellar was organized better than any she'd seen. She did not tell him about the rocking chair and the lamp and the cord and the absence of bracing. Some things didn't translate into letters. Some things you had to be in the room to understand. December came in hard and permanent. The valley below the cabin, visible from the eastern window on clear mornings, disappeared under snow that piled and drifted and reshaped the landscape into something that looked like an entirely different place than the one she'd arrived at. The short days shortened further. They were burning the lamps by mid-afternoon. The cold took on the quality of a fourth wall in the cabin. Present, solid, something you navigated around. This was also when Eleanor began to see the thing about Silas Kane that she hadn't been prepared for, and that bothered her in ways she couldn't entirely account for. He helped everyone, not in a way that advertised itself, not in a way that built a balance sheet of favors owed. He just consistently, quietly, without apparent need for acknowledgement, showed up when people needed things and did the things they needed, and then left without making it a story. He spent 3 days helping old Wren reinforce his roof before the deep freeze. He hauled supplies to the Vesper family twice in a week when Jacob's back gave out, and he did it in the early morning so Jacob wouldn't have to watch. He fixed the alderman's fence line after a deadfall took out a section, and he did it so cleanly that Hector didn't notice for 2 days. Eleanor watched this and she wasn't sure what she felt. Admiration, partly. The genuine kind that didn't need to announce itself. But also, underneath it, something harder to name, something that was almost like fear, except pointed in an unexpected direction. She recognized it, finally, one afternoon in mid-December when she was bringing in wood, and she watched Silas across the yard helping young Tom Vesper, who had come by on some errand, lift a piece of equipment that was too heavy for one person. Watch the care he took. Watch the way he positioned himself to carry most of the weight without making it obvious. What she felt was, this man is going to get hurt. Not from the equipment, from the mathematics of it, from the simple, relentless arithmetic of a person who gave more than they took, consistently, without rest. She had seen what that equation did to people over time. She had seen it in her mother's hands, in the way her mother's back had started to curve in the last years, in the tiredness that had settled into her mother's eyes and never quite left. She brought the wood inside and stacked it with more force than was necessary. That evening at dinner, she said, "You gave the Vespers your extra tallow candles. They needed them more. They needed them. You may also need them." He cut a piece of bread. "We have enough." "You keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." "Silas?" She said his name with a directness that made him look up. It was only the second or third time she'd used his first name. "You can't give everything away and expect it not to matter eventually." He looked at her for a long moment with those dark eyes that she was learning to read incrementally, imperfectly, the way you learn to read a landscape. Not all at once, but feature by feature over time. "You sound like you're worried," he said. "I'm being practical." The corner of his mouth moved in the way that was almost a smile. "Practical? Is that what that is?" "Don't." She looked at her plate. "Don't make it into something it isn't." "I wasn't." His voice was even. "I was just noting." A pause. "Eleanor, I've been doing this for 9 years. Longer. I know where the lines are." "Do you?" "Yes." She looked up. He was still watching her, and in his expression was something she hadn't seen from him before. Something almost like gratitude, except subdued. As if he were surprised by what she'd said and was not sure what to do with the surprise. "I'll be more careful," he said. She didn't believe him entirely, but she believed he meant it, which was different. Outside, the December dark pressed against the windows. The valley below was invisible, buried. The mountain above them was a presence felt rather than seen, enormous and indifferent and permanent. And in the cabin, at the table, 2 people sat across from each other in the lamplight, occupying a silence that had been, without either of them engineering it, slowly filling in around the edges with something that was not quite comfort, and not quite its opposite. Eleanor picked up her fork. Silas picked up his. The fire continued its steady, uninstructed work, and the invisible wall she'd been holding around herself, the one she'd built on the morning her father said it's been arranged and reinforced on every mile of the road north, remained standing, mostly, almost entirely, except for the small places at the edges where the cold got through, and where something else, not quite warmth, but something honest and unpracticed and real, had begun, without her permission, to get through instead. January arrived without ceremony and without mercy. There was no single morning where Eleanor woke up and thought, this is the hard winter they warned about. It happened the way most serious things happened, gradually, then all at once. The temperature dropped past the point where the thermometer nailed to the cabin's outer wall could register it. The snow stopped being occasional and became simply the permanent condition of the world. The valley below, visible on clear mornings from her eastern window, ceased to exist as anything other than a white abstraction. The mountains closed in, not literally, not in any way she could have pointed to and described, but the horizon shrank and the sky lowered and the world contracted to the cabin and the yard and the woodpile and the well path that had to be broken open every single morning before anything else could happen. The cold was different from any cold Eleanor had known. It had weight, substance. You felt it pressing against the cabin walls at night like something that wanted in, and some nights it sounded like the wood itself was cracking under the pressure of it. Sharp percussive reports that broke into sleep and left her lying in the dark with her heart going fast before she remembered where she was. Silas told her the first time it happened that it was just the timber contracting, normal, expected, nothing to worry about. It sounds like something breaking, she said. Wood does that in the cold. It'll do it all winter. You get used to it. She did get used to it, eventually. But she noticed that even Silas, who had lived through 9 winters in these mountains, sometimes opened his eyes in the dark at the sound of it. Some things you accommodated without fully accepting. The routines they had established in the fall, the parallel rhythms of 2 people managing a shared space without crowding each other, tightened under the pressure of January into something more genuinely cooperative. Not because they had decided to cooperate more, because the winter demanded it and left no room for the luxury of maintained distance. They developed a system for the mornings without discussing it. Eleanor got the cook stove going first thing, before the cabin temperature could fully register how cold the night had made it, while Silas broke open the well path and brought in the first load of wood. By the time he came back in, face red, breath coming in visible puffs, there was heat and coffee and usually something on the stove. He would sit down and she would put the coffee in front of him, and he would wrap his hands around the mug and neither of them would speak for several minutes. Just exist in the same space and let the warmth and the caffeine do their work. It wasn't companionship exactly. It was something more functional than that, and maybe more honest. 2 people who had each separately understood that winter at altitude was not a backdrop to life but the primary fact of it, and who had separately decided to meet that fact without complaint. Still, there were mornings Eleanor stood at the window watching the dark give way to a gray that barely qualified as light, with the thermometer outside reading temperatures that made the air physically painful to breathe, and she felt the isolation of it settle into her chest like the cold settled into the logs. She thought about streets, sounds of other people, the particular quality of light in places where the sun wasn't blocked by mountains for half the day. She didn't say these things. But one morning in the second week of January, Silas came in from the yard and found her standing at the window with the coffee she'd poured herself 20 minutes ago, still in her hand, untouched and certainly cold by then. He didn't ask what she was thinking. He poured his own coffee and came and stood beside her at the window, close enough that she could feel the cold still coming off his coat, and they both looked at the white and gray world outside. After a while, he said, "Worst of it's usually the first half of January. Once you're past that, you can start seeing the other side of it." "I'm not struggling," she said, which was partly true. "I know. I wasn't suggesting you were." She looked at him sideways. He was watching the yard, the horses visible through the barn's open upper door, the woodpile diminished by another few cords from where it had been in December. "What did you do?" she said. "Before? On mornings like this?" He considered the question. "Worked. Usually, if there's nothing to do with your hands, the thinking gets loud." "Yes," she said. "Just that." He glanced at her. "Your letter to your father. It's been sitting on the table almost finished for 4 days." She blinked. She hadn't realized he'd noticed. "I don't know how to finish it." "What's left to say?" She looked back out the window. "I don't know what to tell him about any of this." She made a vague gesture that encompassed the cabin, the winter, everything she didn't have clean words for. "He'll ask if I'm all right, and I'll have to either lie or explain, and I don't know how to explain." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Are you?" "All right." The question came out more carefully than his questions usually came, like he'd been deciding whether to ask it. Eleanor turned it over honestly. Not the automatic response. The real one. I'm not all right," she said finally. "I'm just not what I expected to be. By now. I thought I'd know more by now." "Know more about what?" "About whether—" She stopped, looked at the untouched coffee in her hand, set it on the windowsill. "About whether any of this makes sense." He didn't tell her it made sense. She would have been annoyed if he had, because it would have been the reflexively reassuring thing to say, rather than the true thing. Instead, he said, "Most things don't make sense in January. You have to wait them out." She almost smiled. "Practical," she said. "It's what I've got." She picked up her coffee again. It was cold. She drank it anyway. That afternoon, she finished the letter to her father. It was the 3rd week of January when Jacob Vesper came on foot to the cabin door, which was the first sign something was wrong because Jacob Vesper did not walk 3 miles through January drifts without serious reason. Eleanor saw him from the window before he knocked. The bent-forward posture of a man fighting wind, the way he was moving too fast for safety on the iced path. and she had the door open before his hand hit the wood. "What happened?" she said. He was breathing hard, red-faced from cold and exertion, his beard carrying ice crystals. "It's Ruth Alderman. She fell this morning. Hector thinks it might be her hip. He can't move her alone, and I—" He looked past Eleanor to Silas, who had appeared behind her. "I came straight here." Silas was already putting on his coat. "I'll come too," Eleanor said. Both men looked at her. Silas opened his mouth to say something she was fairly sure would be an objection based on the temperature outside, and she looked at him with an expression that closed that door before he could open it. "All right," he said. The Alderman property was 40 minutes in good conditions. They made it in less, moving with the particular urgency of people who understood that a woman with a broken hip in a cabin in January was a situation where every hour mattered. Eleanor kept up without comment, which she could feel both men registering. Ruth Alderman was on the floor of her kitchen. She had the specific dignity of a woman who is in considerable pain and refusing to perform distress about it, lying on her side with her jaw set and her eyes sharp, and Hector kneeling beside her looking like he'd aged 5 years since morning. "Don't make a production of it," Ruth said when they came in. "We won't," Eleanor said and crouched beside her. "Where does it hurt?" "My hip. The right one. I was carrying wood and the ice." Ruth's jaw tightened. "I went down hard." "Can you move it at all?" "A little. Less than this morning." Ruth looked at her with those direct eyes that hadn't lost any of their sharpness for being in pain. "It might not be broken. It might just be—" "Either way, you can't stay on the floor." Eleanor looked up at Silas. He had already assessed the room. She could see it in the way his gaze had moved across it. The narrow hallway to the bedroom, the furniture that would need to be moved. He caught her eye and gave a single nod. What followed was a careful, unglamorous, collaborative hour. Moving Ruth Alderman from the kitchen floor to her bed without causing more damage than had already been done required 4 people. 2 lengths of wool blanket, the kitchen table moved to the wall, and the patience of people who understood the difference between moving fast and moving well. Ruth bore it with the teeth-set stoicism of a woman who had survived this country for 30 years and considered pain a logistical problem rather than a tragedy. When it was done, Ruth settled, her hip immobilized as well as they could manage, Hector beside her looking only marginally less wrecked. Eleanor sat at the alderman's kitchen table and drank the coffee Hector pressed on her with shaking hands and felt the cold slowly leave her bones. From the bedroom, she could hear Ruth's voice, already moving from pain to practicality. "The feed for the chickens is in the lean-to, not the main barn. Hector never remembers." "I remember," Hector said. "You don't." Silas caught Eleanor's eye across the table. His expression was complicated. The seriousness of the situation and something underneath it that was almost, not quite, a shared recognition of the specific rhythm of a long marriage. Eleanor looked away before she could examine what she felt about that. They stayed until late afternoon, getting the Alderman property organized for whatever the coming days would require. Feed handled, water brought in, wood stacked in the kitchen so Hector wouldn't have to go out for it every few hours. Silas repaired a draft gap in the bedroom window without being asked. He did it so efficiently and so quietly that Hector didn't notice it happening, just found it done when he looked up. On the walk back, dusk coming fast, the cold sharpening toward its nightly worst, Eleanor and Silas moved in silence for a long stretch, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, the kind that comes after something shared. "She'll be all right," Eleanor said. It was half assessment, half something she needed to say out loud. "She's tough enough," Silas agreed. He was breaking trail, which he'd done without discussion on the way there too, walking slightly ahead to press the path flat where the drifts were deepest. "Hector's the one I'm watching. He's not good when she's hurting. He loves her very much. 33 years. Silas said it with the matter-of-fact tone he used for concrete measurements. 33 years. Same weight as 4 cords of wood or 3 days north. Does that seem like a long time to you?" He walked a few steps before answering. "Seems like something I don't have a frame for." She absorbed that. They walked. The pines on either side of the path held their snow in that specific way of deep winter, weighted and still. The whole forest in a kind of suspended silence beneath the darkening sky. "What you did today," Eleanor said. "The window. You didn't have to do that. It was letting in cold. You do that. Fix things people haven't noticed need fixing. She paused, working out how to say the next part. You do it without expecting them to see it. If you fix something for the acknowledgement, that's a different thing than fixing it because it needs fixing. I know. That's what I'm... She stopped walking for a moment, and he stopped too, and they were facing each other in the blue dark of the winter evening, with their breath showing and the cold doing what January cold does. I'm not criticizing you. I want to be clear about that. He waited. I'm trying to understand you, she said. I have been, since I got here. You're not what I understood men to be, mostly, in my experience. Something shifted in his face, not defensiveness, more like careful attention, the way he listened to people when he was actually listening. What did you understand men to be? Louder, she said, about what they wanted, louder and more, present, in a way that took up your space. She looked at her boots for a second. My father is a kind man mostly, but everything in that cabin was arranged around what he needed. My mother just built her life in the spaces that were left. Silas was quiet long enough that she looked up. That's not what I want, he said, for you to live in the spaces that are left. The words were so direct and so unperformed that Eleanor felt them land somewhere below the level of response. She didn't know what to say to them. She wasn't sure she needed to say anything. She held his gaze for 3 seconds, 4, then turned and started walking again, and after a breath he fell in beside her. They walked the rest of the way home side by side instead of one ahead of the other. It was a small thing, she noticed it. The hard cold that everyone had been predicting, the kind that went beyond normal winter into something that tested the actual structural limits of preparedness, arrived in the last week of January and didn't lift through the first half of February. Eleanor had thought she understood cold by then. She had been wrong. This was cold that made January's first weeks feel mild. Cold that killed the argument about whether you really needed to do the thing you'd been putting off, because at these temperatures you either did necessary things or you suffered the consequences of not doing them. Cold that killed the Vesper's second cow, which was a disaster that Silas learned about and responded to by arriving at their door the following morning with half a dressed elk he'd taken from his own stores. Jacob Vesper tried to refuse. Eleanor, who had gone along with Silas that morning, watched the exchange from a few feet away. I can't take this, Jacob said. He was trying to hold his voice steady. You'll need it yourself. We have enough. Silas, Jacob. Silas said his name with the particular weight he put into a name when he meant someone to hear him. You've got 2 children. Take it. Jacob Vesper looked at the elk. Looked at Silas. His jaw moved. I'll find a way to pay this back. You don't need to. I do. I need to. He picked up the elk with both hands, the effort of it visible. I need to be a man who pays back what he owes. Silas looked at him for a long moment. All right, he said, when you're able. It was the right answer. Eleanor could see that, the way Jacob's shoulders came down a fraction. Silas had given him both the help and the dignity of owing it, which was sometimes the harder gift. On the walk home, she said, you knew he needed to feel like it was a debt. He did need that. Most people would have pressed the generosity, made him take it as a gift. Gifts given to proud people stop them from taking what they need next time. He said it simply, not as wisdom, just as a thing he'd understood. If he thinks it's a loan, he'll ask again if he needs to. Eleanor walked beside him through the white silence of the woods and thought about the difference between giving someone what they asked for and giving them what they needed, and about how few people she'd known who understood there was a difference. The night she found out about the stove happened on a Tuesday, in the second week of February. She had not been sleeping well. The cold crack of the timber had come back in the worst nights of the deep freeze, and her body had not fully adjusted to treating it as background noise. She woke at some point in the early morning hours with the particular clarity of sleeplessness, aware of the quiet in the way you become aware of it when something is missing. The stove in her room had gone out, not unusual. It happened on the coldest nights when the wood burned through faster than expected. She got up. The floor was a specific cold against her feet that she would not describe as anything other than shocking, and padded to the main room to get kindling to restart it. The main room was dark. The main stove, the larger one that heated the central space, was burning low. Not out. Just low, the way a fire went when it had been burning for hours without attention, producing heat but not the generous heat of a well-stoked fire. She stood in the dark and looked at the stove and then at Silas's bedroll, laid out on the floor beside the main stove, the way it had been every single night since she arrived. That was when she understood something she should have understood sooner. The cabin had her room, with its small stove, and the main room with the large stove. There was a third space, barely a room, more an alcove between the main room and the back wall, where Silas kept tools and equipment. No stove, no fireplace connection. She had seen him go there at night and assumed there was more to it than she'd seen. She went to the alcove now, in the early morning dark, and held the lamp up. A bedroll on the floor, a single wool blanket that she recognized as the oldest, thinnest one from the storage chest, a small pile of personal items, and a stove that, as she now understood, did not exist, had never existed. The alcove was the coldest part of the cabin because it backed against the north wall and received no direct heat from either of the stoves. He had been sleeping in the alcove, not in the main room as she'd believed, watching the main stove through the night, in the coldest corner of the cabin with one thin blanket for, she tried to calculate it, since she arrived, since October. Through the worst of the deep freeze that had been killing livestock and cracking timber and pushing the whole valley to its limits. Eleanor stood in the alcove with the lamp and her cold feet and felt something move through her that was not a simple emotion. It was too layered for that. There was anger in it, the specific anger of someone who had been managed, who had been making assumptions while someone else worked hard to maintain those assumptions. There was something that might have been guilt, though she pushed back against that because she had not known, could not have known. And underneath both of those, something that had no clean name, a feeling that was adjacent to grief and adjacent to wonder, and not fully either. She went back to the main room. Silas was awake. He was sitting up on his bedroll. He must have heard her moving, she realized. He was the kind of sleeper who heard things. And in the low light from the stove, his face was difficult to read. "You were in the alcove," she said. He didn't answer immediately. "You've been sleeping in the alcove all winter." She said it flat, not a question. "My gear's in there. It made sense to—" "Silas." She sat down across from him on the floor because she wasn't going to have this conversation standing over him. "Don't. Please don't explain it into something practical." He looked at her. In the near dark with the stove's low glow between them, his face had the look of someone who had been found out and hadn't decided yet what to do about it. "You said you'd need your own room," he said finally. "Your own space. I meant that. I know you meant it. But there's a difference between respecting my space and—" She stopped, started again. "It's February. It's 20 below on the warm nights. You have been sleeping in the coldest part of this cabin with one blanket. I run warm. You said that in October. It's not October." He was quiet. "Why didn't you—" She pressed the heel of her hand against her forehead. The anger was there, but she couldn't direct it cleanly, because what he'd done was not unkind. It was not manipulative. It was a man starving himself of basic warmth because he'd made a promise and didn't know how to renegotiate it. "You could have told me. You weren't ready for me to tell you. You don't know that. In October?" He held her gaze. "Eleanor, in October you were holding yourself like someone waiting for an attack. That's not a criticism. You had every reason. I wasn't going to push, not for that." She sat with that for a moment. The fire shifted and settled and gave off a small additional pulse of warmth. "And now?" she said. "Now it's February, and you found out anyway." The corner of his mouth did the thing that was almost a smile, but quieter than usual. She looked at the dying fire and thought about the letter on the table and the hawk on the ridge and 4 chairs at a one-man table. She thought about the elk he'd given the Vespers and the window he'd repaired at the Alderman's and the way he stood beside her at her own window on bad January mornings without trying to fix the things she was feeling. She thought about what her mother had said about watching the small things. She had been watching. She had not seen this one, and that bothered her. But she had seen enough of the others to know what kind of man the small things were pointing toward. Not a perfect man. Not a man without limits or complications. A man who was sometimes so careful with other people's comfort that he forgot to account for his own. She stood up, went to the storage chest and took out the heaviest blanket, her own, from her bed. The good one she'd brought from her father's property. She came back and held it out. He looked at it, then at her. "Take it," she said. "Eleanor, you can't maintain this cabin if you freeze to death." She said it the way he said things. Practical, just the fact. "Take the blanket." He took it, slowly with the care of someone receiving something they'd decided not to want. She stood in the middle of the main room for a moment. The fire needed wood. The night still had hours in it. Her own room was cold with the stove out, and the floor of this room was cold under her feet, and the mountains outside were doing what mountains in February did. She thought about walls, the ones you built because you needed them, and the ones you maintained past the point of necessity, out of habit or fear, or the simple inertia of having always had them up. "Bring your bedroll into the main room," she said. "You can tend the stove through the night without sleeping in the cold to do it." He was very still. "It's not," she started, then stopped. She wasn't going to explain it into something it wasn't, any more than she'd let him do it. "Just come out of the cold," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. In his face, she could see the thing she'd seen at the campfire in October. The careful, honest man who had told her he'd make no demands, and had spent 4 months proving it in ways she was only now fully accounting for. He picked up his bedroll. He moved it into the main room, near the stove, the way it should have been all winter. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, went back to her room, restarted her own stove with the kindling from the main room and got back into bed and lay in the dark listening to the fire take hold, and then to the sounds from the main room, the stove being carefully restoked, the quiet efficiency of a man who knew exactly how to do the thing he was doing. The cold crack of the timber came once, sharp and loud, in the hour before dawn. Eleanor opened her eyes at the sound, lay still, listened to the silence after it. From the main room, nothing, no movement. He had not woken, or if he had, he'd gone back to sleep. For the first time in weeks, someone was tending that stove through the night who wasn't doing it from a cold alcove with one thin blanket. Eleanor closed her eyes. Outside, the mountains stood in their endless, indifferent dark. But inside the small cabin on their side, 2 fires burned, both of them steadily, both of them with enough fuel to last through whatever was left of the night and into whatever came with morning. The morning after Eleanor moved Silas's bedroll into the main room, neither of them mentioned it. This was, she had come to understand, one of the specific ways they were alike. Neither of them needed to narrate a thing that had already happened. The bedroll was there. The stove had been tended through the night properly for the first time in months. Whatever that meant, it meant it without requiring a conversation about what it meant. She made coffee. He came in from the morning chores with ice in his beard and sat down, and she put the mug in front of him and sat across the table, and they drank their coffee in the particular silence that had become, without her noticing the exact moment of the change, a comfortable one. February ground on. The deep freeze held for another 10 days before it broke. Not into warmth. Warmth was still 2 months away, maybe more, but into the comparative relief of temperatures that merely required vigilance rather than constant emergency. The valley slowly reassembled itself. Neighbors who had been pinned inside for weeks appeared on the roads again, moving between properties with the careful, energized quality of people who had survived something and were still processing the surprise of it. Ruth Alderman's hip turned out to be badly bruised rather than broken, which was the kind of good news that arrived on the frontier as a profound relief rather than anything to be expected. She was on her feet again by mid-February, moving with a slight hitch that she refused to acknowledge, and would, Eleanor suspected, refuse to acknowledge for the rest of her life. She sent Hector over with a pot of something and a handwritten note that said, in Ruth's spare handwriting, "You and your husband handled yourselves well in January. I've seen capable people in this valley, and I've seen useless ones. You're the former." Eleanor read the note twice, folded it, put it in the chest in her room, in the same place she kept her mother's letters. "You and your husband." She turned the phrase over a few times without quite meaning to. The thaw, when it finally started coming, was a gradual and argumentative process. March in the mountains was not spring in any meaningful sense. It was the season of mud and false warmth and late storms that came in without warning and dumped another foot of snow on ground that had almost convinced itself it was done with all that. Eleanor watched it happen and thought of the frontier as a place fundamentally resistant to sentimentality. It would not let you feel too good about something before reminding you of the conditions under which you were feeling it. But the days were getting longer. The hawk was back on the South Ridge most mornings. The horses, who had spent 2 months in a state of stoic endurance in the barn, began showing interest in things again. Ears moving, heads lifting, the small signals of animals whose instincts told them the worst was technically over, even if the weather hadn't fully received the message. Silas began ranging farther from the property again, now that the conditions permitted it. He was running his trap lines, replenishing what winter had drawn down, doing the work of early spring that would carry them through to the season where the land started giving back. Eleanor did not miss his presence during these longer absences in the way she would have refused to admit 3 months ago. She noticed them, which was not the same thing, but it was enough of something that she did not pretend to herself that it wasn't. One evening in the 3rd week of March, he came back from a 2-day run with his pack carrying, among other things, a cloth-wrapped parcel that he set on the table without explanation. Eleanor was mending something. She was always mending something. The frontier consumed fabric at a rate that felt almost aggressive. And she looked at the parcel and then at him. "What is that?" she said. "Open it." She set down the mending. Inside the cloth was a book. Not new. Old, actually, with a cracked spine and the slightly soft cover of something that had been read many times by many hands. The title was in faded lettering, a collection of natural history essays, the kind of densely observational writing that cataloged birds and their behaviors in the specific loving detail of someone who had spent a very long time watching them. Eleanor looked up. "Wren had it," Silas said, pulling off his coat. "He mentioned the hawk. I mentioned you'd been watching it. He wanted you to have it. That's Wren's book. He's got 3 others on the same subject. He said this was the one for mountain birds specifically." Silas hung up his coat. He said he'd rather it went to someone who'd actually use it. Eleanor looked back down at the book, opened the first page. The print was small and dense, and exactly the kind of thing she would read slowly, deliberately, in the good hours of morning light. "Thank him for me," she said. "You can thank him yourself. He's coming down from the ridge next week." She ran her thumb along the spine of the book. It was a small thing. Again, just a small thing, the pattern of her whole time here. But it landed with a weight that had nothing to do with its size. She had mentioned the hawk to Silas in October, briefly, standing at the window. He had listened, the way he listened to things, and filed it away. And months later, in the middle of a trap run, he had come across something relevant and acted on the memory. "Silas," she said. He was at the basin washing his hands. He looked over. She wanted to say something that was adequate to the accumulation of it. The lanolin on the shelf, the morning at the window, the alcove and the blanket, the book, all of it. But the English language was not cooperating, or maybe she was not cooperating with it. She looked at him and he looked back at her and she said, "Thank you," which was not adequate and was also perhaps the only honest thing. He held her gaze. "You're welcome," he said, in the tone that meant he understood what she was actually thanking him for. It was the 1st week of April, mud season in full, determined, unromantic force, when Eleanor received the letter from her father. Thomas Pierce wrote in the same style he talked, direct, minimal, not unkind. He was well enough. The property had made it through the winter without major damage. A neighbor had helped with the roof. He wanted to know if she was managing. He also wanted to know, and this he wrote in a way that suggested it had taken him some effort to include it, the phrasing slightly stiff around the edges, whether she was content, not happy, not flourishing. Content, which was his particular ceiling for what he could bring himself to hope for. Eleanor sat with the letter for a long time. She was at the table, the late afternoon light coming through the window at an angle that was visibly, noticeably longer than it had been even 2 weeks ago. And the mud outside was the specific productive mud of a landscape undergoing change. And somewhere on the South Ridge, the hawk was doing what it did at this hour. Silas was outside. She could hear him. The rhythm of work, familiar now in the way the cabin's sounds were familiar. The specific percussion of his mornings and afternoons that she had been learning since October, like learning a language. Without consciously meaning to, she had become fluent in the sounds of him. She wrote back to her father. She wrote that she was well, that the winter had been hard, but they had managed, that the cabin was better than she'd expected and the neighbors were good people and Ruth Alderman was a woman their mother would have respected. She wrote about the hawk, briefly, knowing her father wouldn't be particularly interested, but writing it anyway because it felt like something he should know about her life. Then she stopped and looked at the window and wrote, "I think I am more than content, Pa. I think I am building something I didn't know I was going to want." She read that sentence back, let it stand. Outside, Silas's footsteps came across the yard and stopped at the door. She heard him check the horses the way he always did before coming in. A pause, a low word to them, and then his boots on the step. He came inside and looked at her at the table with the letter in front of her. "Your father?" he said. "Yes." "Everything all right with him?" "He's well. He wants to know if I'm content." She looked up. "I told him I was more than that." Something happened in Silas's expression that was slow enough to watch, like a room where someone has gradually turned up the light. Not a sudden change, but a change that becomes visible all at once it's gone far enough. "Good," he said. Just that. But the word had weight behind it that she could feel from across the table. She folded the letter and sealed it. Looked at him, still standing near the door with the outdoor cold still about him, with the tired posture of a man who had been working all day. "Sit down," she said. "I'll put dinner on." He sat. She moved around the cook stove, and there was something in the normalcy of that movement. The two of them in the kitchen space, him at the table, her at the stove, the day winding down outside. That felt suddenly and undeniably like something real. Not arranged. Not accommodated. Real. It scared her a little. She let it. April moved toward May, and with it came the conversation that both of them had been approaching from a distance for months, taking small steps toward and then not quite reaching. It happened on an evening after Wren's visit. The old man had come down from the ridge, spent an afternoon talking with Eleanor about the hawk and the book and the specific patterns of raptors and mountain thermals, with a depth of knowledge that was astonishing and a manner that was so completely without performance that she found herself genuinely absorbed, forgetting to manage the impression she was making. Silas sat with them and mostly listened, occasionally adding something, his eyes moving between Eleanor and the old man with an expression she caught twice and didn't fully decode. After Wren left, they sat on the bench outside the cabin in the late light, something they'd begun doing in the past few weeks, when the evenings became bearable enough for it. The mountains were doing what mountains did at this hour, turning colors that weren't quite describable and going gradually dark. And the air had the particular quality of spring evenings at altitude, clean and cold-edged, even in the warmth. "He liked you," Silas said. "I liked him. He doesn't like most people. He barely tolerates most people. He likes you. I've been here 9 years. He had to eventually." He stretched out his legs in front of him. "He talked to you like you'd been here 9 years. Eleanor looked at the ridge where the hawk's thermals were. "Maybe I feel like I have." It came out more honest than she'd intended, the way the true things were starting to do. She did not take it back. Silas turned to look at her. In the fading light, his face was... He was not handsome in the ways she'd grown up understanding the word, and she had stopped thinking of it in those terms somewhere around January. His face was his face. She knew it now the way you knew a landscape you'd lived inside for months, the specific angles of it, the way it moved when he was thinking. "Eleanor," he said, her name in his voice, just like that. "Don't make it into a speech," she said quietly. "Whatever you're going to say, don't make it a speech." He almost smiled. "I was going to ask you something." "Then ask it." He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone preparing words, but the silence of someone deciding how honest to be. She recognized the difference now. "When the pass opens," he said, "you'll have options. You know that. I'm not..." He stopped. Tried again. "What we came here as is not what I want us to stay, as if you'd rather something different." She looked at him. "What did we come here as?" "An arrangement." The word was neutral in his mouth, but not without weight. "Your father and me at a table, you not in the room. And what would you want instead?" She asked it without softness and without edge, just the direct question. He held her gaze steadily. "I'd want you to choose this. Not because you arrived here and made the best of it, because you actually want it." A pause. I'd want to be chosen rather than assigned. The word landed, chosen. She sat with it in the cooling evening air, with the mountains going dark around them and the first stars becoming visible in the east, and she thought about the morning. Her father sat across the table from her, and she thought about $11 and one horse. And she thought about all the ways she had arrived at this bench that had nothing to do with her own decision. And then she thought about the things that had nothing to do with circumstances. The hawk, the book, the soup that she'd made because she felt like it, the blanket she'd held out in the dark, the letter she'd written today with the sentence that had surprised her by being true. "You've been patient," she said, "since October. I told you I would be." Most men couldn't. She meant it as observation, not flattery. "I don't have much interest in what most men can do." He said it without arrogance, just as his own flat fact. She looked at the first stars. Venus, probably, at this hour. Her mother had known the stars and had passed along what she knew, the way she passed along everything, practically, without romance. Here is what this is, and here is why it matters. "I'm not the same as I was in October," she said slowly. "No, I'm not. I wasn't trying to become something. I didn't plan it. I know. It just..." She turned her palms up on her knees. "It just happened while I was living here. I stopped bracing for something and started just being here. In this." She looked at the cabin behind them, the lit window, the stacked wood, the barn where the horses were settling in for the night. "And I realized at some point that this was not just something I was enduring. It was mine." Silas said nothing, but the quality of his silence had changed. "You're mine," she said, and her voice was steady because she had found the truth of it before she said it, which was the only way it could come out without shaking. "Not because my father decided it, because I'm deciding it now, tonight, on this bench." She met his eyes. "That's what I'd want you to know." He looked at her for a long time. She could see the things moving in his face, not hidden from her now, not after the months of slow learning. She could see the thing it meant to him, to be told this, by her specifically, in these words. His hand moved on the bench between them, not taking her hand, asking, leaving it there, palm up, open. A question with no pressure behind it, the same as every other thing he had ever offered her. She put her hand in his. It was not graceful. Their fingers didn't interlock in any particularly cinematic way. His hand was much larger than hers and considerably rougher, and her hand was cold from the evening air, and neither of them said anything for a while. They just sat on the bench in the spring dark with the mountains around them and the stars coming out and their hands together on the wood between them. She thought about what she'd told her father. Building something I didn't know I was going to want. Yes, that was it. That was exactly it. "I want to say something," Silas said eventually. "Say it. I'm not good at this." He looked at their hands. "I never was. I don't say the right things in the right order. I work better when I can just..." He stopped, tried again. "I need you to know that what I said in October, on the road, that I had no expectations of you. I meant that. I still mean it. But I should also tell you that somewhere around December, I stopped thinking of you as someone I was trying not to burden and started thinking of you as..." He paused. "As someone I could not imagine this being the same without." Eleanor looked at the side of his face. He was not looking at her, looking at the dark outline of the ridge, and in his profile she could see the effort of the honesty, the cost of saying it out loud after months of not saying it. "December," she said. "Around then. I'm not precise about it." "What happened in December?" He was quiet for a moment. "You told me I gave too much away. You were worried about the supplies." He glanced at her. "Nobody'd said that to me before. Nobody told me to be more careful with myself." Eleanor thought of that conversation. The directness she'd meant only practically. The way he'd looked at her across the table. "I was being practical," she said. "I know. That was the part that..." He made a short sound that she recognized after a moment as a laugh, or the very beginning of one. "That was the part that undid me, actually." She stared at him. "Being practical at you undid you. You were worried. You didn't want to be worried. You were anyway." He looked at her, and in the dark his eyes were very direct. "That's not nothing." Eleanor looked back at the ridge. The hawk was long gone to roost. The stars were out properly now, the whole spread of them, the mountain sky doing what mountain skies did at night when there was no competing light for miles in any direction. "No," she said, "it's not nothing." She did not let go of his hand. He did not let go of hers. They sat until the cold of the evening became serious enough that staying outside was a choice rather than a default. And then they went inside, and the door closed behind them on the dark and the cold and the mountains. The fire in the main room was burning well. It was warm inside, the kind of warmth that had been built deliberately over months and that now existed independent of the weather outside. Eleanor stood in the middle of the room for a moment after the door closed, her hand no longer in his. They'd separated naturally coming inside, the movement of ordinary life reasserting itself. And she looked at the table with the lamp on it and the two chairs pulled up to it and the book about mountain birds on the shelf she'd found for it. She had not been asked to build this. She had not planned it. She had arrived in October with her trunk and her fury and her careful mother-learned habit of watching the small things, and somewhere in the months between then and now, between the soup and the window and the blanket in the dark, the small things had added up to something she hadn't seen coming, which was, she thought, probably the only way it ever really happened. Not the arranged version, not the decided version, the accumulated version, the version built from months of cornbread and hawk watching and sitting on benches in the cold, and learning a person the way you learned a landscape, feature by feature, until one day you looked up and realized you knew it. "I'm going to write to my father again tomorrow," she said. Silas looked up from banking the stove for the night. "I'm going to tell him," she said, "that the arrangement worked out. Not for the reasons he intended." She met his eyes. "But properly." He held her gaze, and the thing in his face was quiet and full and entirely real. "All right," he said. She went to her room, lay in the dark with the stove doing its work, and the mountains outside her eastern window, and the knowledge, settled and solid, and finally without the need to be examined or defended, that she was exactly where she had chosen to be. The pass opened in the second week of May. Eleanor knew it before anyone told her because the quality of sound changed. The valley below the cabin, silent for months under its layers of snow and ice, began carrying noise again. Distant and faint at first, then gradually more present. The movement of water, the calls of birds returning to lower elevations. The particular acoustic quality of a landscape that had stopped being sealed. The mountains hadn't changed, but the world they enclosed had cracked open again, like something that had been holding its breath for 6 months, and finally let it out. Silas told her over breakfast that Grunewald had come through with the news. The southern route to Harrow was passable. The worst of the drifts had settled enough for wagon traffic. Within a week, maybe 2, people would be moving again. Eleanor poured more coffee into her mug and sat back down and thought about what that meant. Options, Silas had said, back in April on the bench. When the pass opens, you'll have options. She had made her choice on that bench, with the stars coming out and her hand in his. She had meant it, and she still meant it, and she was not renegotiating. But the opening of the pass meant something specific that they had not yet spoken about directly, and it needed to be spoken about, because Eleanor had come to understand that the things you didn't say in a small cabin accumulated the way snow accumulated, quietly, steadily, until the weight of them became structural. "I want to go to Harrow," she said. Silas looked up from his plate. "I want to go to the settlement," she said, "when the pass is fully clear. I want to go with you, and I want to—" She met his eyes. "I want it done properly, in front of people. Not the arrangement, the actual thing." He was very still for a moment, then, "You're sure?" "I said it." People who are sure don't always say things. Sometimes they just— "Silas?" She set down her mug. "I am telling you directly that I want to stand in front of whatever passes for a settlement gathering in Harrow and choose you out loud. That is what I'm saying." A long beat. "All right," he said. His voice was level, but something underneath it was not entirely level, and she was fluent enough in him now to hear the difference. "All right," she said back. She wrote to her father that same morning. Not a long letter. Thomas Pierce did not require long letters and would not have known what to do with one. She told him the pass was opening. She told him she and Silas intended to come through Harrow in May, and that she would like him to make the trip down from his property if his lung permitted, because she was getting married properly and she wanted him there. Not because she needed his blessing, She was done needing permissions from people who had made decisions about her life without her. But because he was her father, and her mother was gone, and there should be someone there who had known her before all of this. She sealed the letter and added it to the post bundle that Grunewald would carry down on his next run. The 2 weeks before the trip were busy in the way that frontier life was always busy when a season turned. The accumulated deferred maintenance of winter releasing all at once into an urgent present tense. Trap lines to run and close, equipment to repair and prep. The kitchen garden, which would need to be started early if it was going to produce anything worth having by August. Eleanor threw herself into all of it with an energy she recognized as partly practical and partly the restless momentum of someone who had made a decision and was now simply waiting for the world to catch up to it. Ruth Alderman came by on a Wednesday, moving with her permanent slight hitch, carrying a covered dish and the expression of a woman who had something to say and intended to say it. "I heard you're going to Harrow," Ruth said, sitting down at the table with the ease of someone who had long since stopped waiting to be invited. "News travels. Everything travels in this valley. There are 8 families and nothing else to talk about." Ruth folded her hands. "You're doing the ceremony properly." "Yes." "Good." Ruth said it with a definitiveness that suggested she had opinions about the original arrangement and had been keeping them professionally. "Your father coming?" "I wrote to him." Ruth nodded slowly. "I have something for you." She reached into the cloth bag she'd carried the dish in and produced a folded piece of fabric. She set it on the table between them. "It was mine. When Hector and I married, it's not fancy. I wasn't a fancy woman even then." Eleanor unfolded it carefully. A dress, or something that had been a dress. Cream-colored once, now ivory with age, simple in cut and construction, with the careful stitching at the collar and cuffs that meant someone had taken time with it, even if they hadn't taken money. "Ruth, it'll need taking in at the waist. You're narrower than I was." Ruth said this without vanity or regret, just measurement. "Hector's sister did the original work, and she was better with a needle than I am, so the bones of it are still good." Eleanor looked at this dress in her hands. She thought about her mother, who would have known exactly what to say right now. Who would have said it with the precise warmth of a woman who understood the weight of things passed between women without ceremony. Eleanor did not have her mother's gift for that kind of speech. "I'll take good care of it," she said. Ruth's expression moved into something that was as close as it got to soft. "Keep it. I didn't bring it for you to return." She stood up, with the careful movement of a hip that had been badly reminded of its own limitations in January. "I brought it because you handled yourself well this winter, better than most who've come to this valley thinking they knew what they were getting into." She paused at the door. "And because Silas Kane is a good man who has been alone too long, and you are apparently the only person he's found worth not being alone with. So," she pulled on her coat, "take the dress." Eleanor stood at the window and watched Ruth make her way back down the path, and she held the folded dress and felt the full complicated weight of what it meant to be witnessed by people who had been paying attention when you weren't looking. The trip to Harrow took 2 days. They went by wagon, the same horses that had brought Eleanor north in October, now fat with winter feed and ready to move. The road was wet in the places the snow had recently surrendered, and dry in the places it had surrendered earlier, and the whole journey had the uneven, slightly chaotic quality of a landscape mid-transformation. Thomas Pierce was waiting at the Harrow trading post. Eleanor saw him from the wagon before he saw them. He was standing by the post's outer wall with the careful stillness of a man whose one good lung required him to ration his exertion, and he looked older than she remembered, which should not have surprised her, and did anyway. 7 months. It had only been 7 months. She got down from his wagon before it fully stopped, which she would later acknowledge was undignified, and walked to her father, and when he put his arms around her, he was thinner than he had been, but his arms were still her father's arms, and she stayed there for a moment longer than she usually allowed herself. "You look well," he said when she stepped back. "I am well." He looked past her to Silas, who had come up behind her and stopped at a respectful distance. The 2 men regarded each other with the cautious, assessing quality of 2 people who shared a significant thing and were figuring out what to do about it. Thomas Pierce extended his hand. "I understand my daughter has decided to keep you," he said. Silas shook his hand. "I understand that too." Thomas looked at Eleanor. something in his watery blue eyes that was not quite an apology, but was adjacent to one. The expression of a man who knew he had done a thing badly and was trying to find out whether the outcome had been worth the method. She made the decision herself, he said, not to Eleanor, to Silas. Yes, sir, Silas said. That was the only way I was interested in it going. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. The way he acknowledged things that mattered without wanting to make more of them than they could hold. The ceremony was not large. The Harrow settlement had a gathering hall, the most permanent-looking building in a collection that was still mostly finding its footing. And on a Saturday in late May, it held perhaps 30 people, which was most of the families from the valley plus the Harrow residents who had made the trip out of curiosity or genuine goodwill, or both. Ruth and Hector Alderman. The Vespers, with both children scrubbed to an implausible cleanliness. Old Wren, who had come down from his ridge specifically, and who stood in the back with the expression of someone fulfilling an obligation he was pleased to fulfill. Grunewald, who stood beside Wren and said nothing, which was his way of showing he was glad to be there. Eleanor wore Ruth's dress, taken in at the waist with her own stitching, which was not as good as Ruth's late sister-in-law's, but was good enough. She had done her hair the way her mother had taught her, which took longer than she'd intended, and came out slightly asymmetrical, which she decided to leave because perfection at this altitude was a waste of energy. There was a man in the settlement who read from a civil register and could solemnize a marriage under territorial law, and he did so with the efficient brevity of a person who had other things to attend to that afternoon, which Eleanor found she preferred to any elaborate alternative. No performance, just the words and the meaning of the words, and the two people saying them. When it came to it, the actual moment of it, standing in front of 30 people she mostly knew, and the registrar she'd just met, and her father, and the dress that had belonged to Ruth Alderman 33 years ago, Eleanor felt something she had not expected. Not nerves, not the complicated, reluctant calculation she had brought to that table in October when her father told her what had been decided. Something cleaner than that. Something that had no apology in it. She looked at Silas. He was looking at her with the direct, unglamorous honesty she had been learning to read since October, and she could see in the particular set of his face that he was feeling the weight of this exactly as much as it deserved to be felt. The registrar asked the questions. They answered them. Eleanor's voice was steady, which did not surprise her. She had found the words before she said them. The way she'd learned was the only way to say true things without shaking. When it was done, the gathering hall made the specific noise of 30 people simultaneously releasing held breath, and someone in the back started clapping, and Ruth Alderman said finally, loud enough to be heard over everything, which made Hector say Ruth in the tone that meant he was trying not to laugh. Thomas Pierce put his hand briefly on Eleanor's shoulder. He was not a man who expressed things easily, which she had known her whole life, and she did not require him to be different. The shoulder touch was sufficient. It was his version of everything. Silas shook her father's hand again. Then, because he was not a man for speeches or public demonstrations, he simply put his hand at the small of Eleanor's back for a moment. Just there, just briefly, the lightest possible contact. And she felt it the way you felt the small things. The gathering afterward was loud and warm and slightly chaotic in the way of any collection of frontier people who didn't often get the excuse to be in the same room. The Vesper children escaped supervision and had to be retrieved twice from behind the registrar's table. Grunewald ate most of the food that had been laid out before anyone else had a realistic chance at it, and was unrepentant. Wren told Eleanor 3 more things about the hawk on the South Ridge, including its probable age and a speculation about whether it was the same bird he'd seen from his ridge 2 years ago, and she listened to all of it because she genuinely wanted to. At some point in the evening, her father found her standing apart from the noise for a moment and stood beside her with the tired, careful posture of a man managing his lung. "I was wrong," he said. Not looking at her, looking at the room. She waited. "About how I did it. The way I arranged it." He was quiet for a moment. "Your mother she would have found a better way. I just didn't—" He stopped. "I was scared of leaving you without anything arranged. That's not an excuse." Eleanor looked at the side of his face. The lines in it were deeper than last year. The winter had been hard everywhere. "I know you were scared," she said. "I was furious. I know. I'm not anymore." She meant it. The fury had composted into something else over the winter. Not forgiveness exactly, because she wasn't sure she needed to call it that, but an understanding of the fear behind it that made the fury seem less necessary. "I'm not anymore, Pa." He nodded, put his hand over hers briefly on the table where she was resting it. His hand was the same hand she had always known, calloused and mapped with work and slightly larger than you expected from a man of his size. "He's a good man," Thomas said. "I know. I found that out myself." "I know you did." He almost smiled. "You always were better at finding things out than being told them." "I wonder where I got that from." He actually smiled then, the rare full version of it, and for a second he looked less like a man with one good lung and more like her father from before everything got hard. She leaned over and kissed his cheek, which surprised them both. They went back to the valley the following Monday with the wagon loaded for the return journey, and Thomas Pierce watching them go from outside the trading post until the road curved and the tree line took him. Eleanor watched until he disappeared and then faced forward and let the morning do what mornings did. The summer was its own education. Everything the winter had held in suspension came forward at once, the garden demanding attention, the property needing the deferred repairs that cold months had simply frozen in place, the trap lines transitioning to the lighter summer work, the horses finally getting the exercise they'd been denied for months. Eleanor worked in the kind of full-body daily exhaustion that left no room for the interior noise she'd carried with her from her father's table all those months ago. The noise had quieted anyway, but the work finished the job. She and Silas fell into each other the way people fall into something real, clumsily, imperfectly, with the occasional friction of two people who had each spent years being primarily responsible for themselves and did not always automatically accommodate another person's presence. They argued twice about the kitchen garden. Once about a decision he made about winter supplies without consulting her, which she told him directly was not acceptable and which he acknowledged directly was not acceptable, and they renegotiated it and moved on. That was the part nobody told you about, Eleanor thought. Not the falling, but the staying, the daily practice of it, the choosing of it again on ordinary days when there was mud on the floor and the stove was being difficult and one of you was tired past the point of grace. She had watched her parents' marriage her whole life and had seen the weight of it without fully understanding the architecture underneath. She was starting to understand. One evening in late July, she was sitting on the bench outside the cabin, the bench that had become theirs in the way that spaces became people's, through repeated use and specific memory. And Silas came and sat beside her, and the evening was warm in the way mountain evenings were warm in summer, which was genuinely warm rather than merely less cold, and the hawk was on the ridge doing its evening thermal work. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said. "About what?" "About October, when I first got here." She watched the hawk. "I was so angry. I was so certain that this was something being done to me." "It was," he said. Partly. She allowed that. "But I've been thinking about how... I've been thinking that if my father had asked me, if he'd come to me and said, 'Here is a man, I think you should meet him. I think you might find him worth knowing,' I probably would have said no." She paused. "Not because he was wrong, because I would have been making the decision from who I was then instead of who I had to become to see it clearly." Silas was quiet for a moment. "That's a generous way to read it." "I'm not reading it generously. I'm reading it honestly. There's a difference." She looked at him. "I'm not saying what he did was right. I'm saying the outcome was real." He looked back at her with those dark eyes that she had been reading for 10 months now, that she could read fairly well, that still occasionally surprised her. "What I know," he said, "is that I've been in this valley 9 years, and in all of it I never once sat on this bench in the evening watching that hawk and felt like it was enough. And now it is." He said it plainly, without reaching for effect. "That's what I know." Eleanor felt the truth of it move through her in the simple way that real things moved, without announcement, without needing to be examined. She reached over and took his hand, the same hand she'd taken in April on this same bench, larger than hers and rougher, still cold calloused, even in summer. The gesture was not new anymore. It was not a decision. It was just what she did. The hawk rode its thermal up and up until it was very small against the blue of the summer sky, and then it banked on some invisible current and dove toward the tree line and was gone. Neither of them spoke for a while. The autumn came the way autumn always came, earlier than you expected and more beautiful than you were prepared for. The valley turned colors that Eleanor, with her book of mountain natural history, could not find adequate vocabulary for. Not because the book was inadequate, but because some things exceeded description, and the correct response to them was not words. She was 3 months along by the time the leaves had fully turned. She knew it in her body before she was certain of it, and when she was certain, she told Silas one morning at the table with the same directness she brought to everything. Set down her coffee, looked at him, said it plainly. He sat very still for a long moment. She watched his face move through something she did not try to decode, let it move at its own pace. "Are you well?" he said finally. "I'm well." He looked at the table, back at her. "Are you—" He paused. "How do you feel about it?" She appreciated that he asked. That was the first thing she appreciated, that he asked how she felt rather than telling her how to feel. "Scared," she said honestly, "and not sorry." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Did not say everything would be fine, because he was not a man who made promises about things outside his control. Did not say he was certain they could manage, because he was not a man who performed certainty he didn't have. Just put his hand over hers and held it there. And that was its own kind of answer. Ruth Alderman cried when she heard, which she immediately denied and which Hector chose wisely to say nothing about. Thomas Pierce wrote back with a letter that was 6 sentences long, which for him was practically a novel. Old Wren gave Eleanor a lecture about the specific effects of altitude on pregnancy that was more detailed than she'd expected, and more useful than most things anyone said, delivered with his characteristic complete absence of sentimentality. The baby came in late May, almost exactly a year after the ceremony in Harrow. Eleanor had been warned it was difficult at altitude. She had also been warned by women who knew that difficult was not impossible, that bodies were capable of more than men generally assumed, and that the specific skill set of a frontier woman was not without application in this circumstance. It was long. It was hard. It was the kind of experience that carved a permanent line in the map of a person's life, a before and after, with no ambiguity about which side you were on. Silas sat outside the room for 11 hours. She knew because she could hear him, not pacing, not making noise, just present. The specific weight of his presence on the other side of a door, which she had learned to recognize. When it was over, when Ruth Alderman put the baby into Eleanor's arms with the tired, satisfied expression of a woman who had been present at this particular miracle. Enough times to be neither awed nor blasé, but something more useful than either. Eleanor looked at the child with the complicated comprehension of someone confronting a reality they had intellectually anticipated and emotionally not prepared for at all. She had her mother's hands. Eleanor noticed this in the first 5 minutes. Not the size or the shape, but the specific way the small hands moved, grasping at nothing with the urgent, uncoordinated need of someone entirely new to having hands. Her mother's hands. She did not know what to do with that information, except hold it. She named her Margaret, for her mother. When Silas came in, finally, Eleanor watched him look at the baby with an expression she had not seen on his face before and recognized with some surprise as the face underneath the face she knew. The unguarded one, the one that didn't know it was being seen. "Come here," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at Margaret, and Margaret, with the categorical indifference of the recently born, looked in no particular direction. "She's very small," he said. "They start that way." He glanced at Eleanor. "How are you?" Tired past the ability to describe it. She shifted Margaret slightly. "And not sorry." He almost smiled. Then he did smile, the full version, rare enough that she counted them, still, and she saw in it what she had first glimpsed back in April and had been accumulating ever since. A man who had spent 9 years being alone in the mountains and was genuinely and unmistakably glad that he wasn't anymore. The second autumn arrived the way second autumns do, familiar and different at once, the same mountains doing the same things but with a new person in the cabin to be doing them around. Margaret was 4 months old and deeply opinionated about the world for someone who could not yet sit up unassisted. She had Eleanor's directness and, apparently, Silas's patience when she wanted something and wasn't getting it, which was its own specific combination and one that Eleanor suspected was going to be remarkable in about 15 years. The valley had changed around them in ways that were gradual and then visible. 2 new families had come in over the summer, young people who had heard the land was worth the hardship. They came to Silas and Eleanor first, before anyone else in the valley, the way people went to a fixed point to orient themselves. Eleanor had noticed this happening and had sat with what it meant. They were not the oldest family in the valley or the most established, but they were, it seemed, the family that people trusted, the one that had shown up in January with half an elk and in February with a repaired window and in March with the particular steadiness of people who had decided to stay when staying was hardest. She thought about trust, about how it moved in 2 directions and was built in neither the grand moments nor the declarations, but in the accumulated ordinary ones. The morning coffee and the broke-open well path and the hand held on the bench in the dark. She thought about what she would tell Margaret someday, not as a lesson. Eleanor was suspicious of lessons wrapped too neatly, the kind that resolved into clean takeaways that missed the actual texture of how things happened. But as an honest account, she would say, "I arrived here angry, and I was right to be angry, and the anger was not wrong." She would say, "I watched everything, every small thing for months, because that is the only honest way to know anything." She would say, "Trust is not given or earned in a single moment. It is something built, imperfectly and over time, by people who are willing to keep building it even when the work is hard and the outcome is uncertain." She would say, "I chose this. Late, after circumstances had already arranged themselves around me, but I chose it." And that choosing was the thing that made it real. On a clear October evening, with Margaret asleep in the cradle Silas had built over the summer, and the fire doing its steady work, and the mountains outside beginning their long fade into the dark, Eleanor sat at the table where she had once sat across from her father and heard her life decided without her. She had her book on mountain birds. She had a letter half written to Thomas Pierce, who had come in August to see his granddaughter, and who had looked at the cabin in the valley and his daughter's face with something that was not exactly peace, but was moving in that direction. Silas came in from outside, stamped the first thin autumn mud from his boots, hung his coat, looked at her at the table and the sleeping baby and the lamplight doing what lamplight does in small cabins on cold evenings. "It's going to be a hard winter," he said. "They usually are," Eleanor said. "I've got 3 more cords to cut before it gets serious." "I know, I counted." He sat down across from her. The same table, the same 2 chairs. In the cradle, Margaret made the small sound she made between deep sleep and shallow, the sound that meant she was still there and fine and entirely herself. "You're not worried," Silas said. Eleanor looked up from her book. "No," she said. "Not about the winter." He looked back at her, and she looked at him, and they were quiet. In the way they were quiet, full, not empty. And the fire moved in the stove, and the mountains stood outside in the early dark, and the second winter of their life together began its slow, inevitable, entirely manageable arrival. She was not the woman who had come here in October with a trunk and a Fury and $11 worth of other options. She was not changed in the way that stories sometimes suggested people changed, completely, cleanly, as though the self were a coat you could take off. She was still direct and still watchful and still impatient with performances of feeling that substituted for the feeling itself. But she was also, now and permanently, a woman who had built something from the inside of a hard choice, who had watched the small things and found out that the small things were the whole of it, who had chosen, out loud, in front of people, after months of finding out whether choosing was warranted. She had been right to watch. She had been right to wait. She had been right when she finally moved, to move toward rather than away. Outside, the first thin skiff of early snow came down on the valley, and the mountains and the bench where they had sat in the spring dark and said the true things. It settled on the woodpile and the well path and the barn roof and the garden that had given good things and would give good things again. Inside, the lamp burned. The fire held. The baby slept. And 2 people who had come together through the worst kind of beginning sat at the same table in the same quiet, neither of them sorry, neither of them finished, both of them exactly where they had, in the end, chosen to be.